The people making a decision about the anchorages are not the Coast Guard employees who are out there operating the icebreakers, who are out there patrolling the waters, from West Point all the way up to Saugerties and throughout the river. The people making this decision really have a disconnect with the kind of culture and the type of concerns that Hudson River Valley communities do have. So it's really important that everyone participate in this public comment period that ends on September 7th and express the concerns in as most of constructive fashion as possible. On that note, I think it's very important that in the comments that we ask for a public hearing, that Coast Guard staff actually come here to New York State and to the Hudson River Valley, hold a public meeting where they can hear from constituents, stakeholders, and users of the river face to face to really fully understand the extent of the concerns that we have. To kind of put John's comments in a little bit more of a specific context, he mentioned that there are 10 locations where there are proposed anchorages and 43 specific different berths that have been proposed from Yonkers all the way up to Northern Dutchess and Ulster County. Specific to this community here, Rhinebeck, and other communities across the river in Ulster County, that amounts to 3 specific locations and 8 different berths. This is about 1/3 of the total proposal of berths that have been proposed. So specifically what's being proposed are 3 at what is known as Kingston Flats South, 1 at Port Ewan, and 4 potential anchor drops at a Big Rock Point just south of Rhinebeck. What's really driving this, just to go and build a little bit more on John's comments from kind of more of a global economic perspective, is there is a huge amount of Bakken crude oil and tar sands crude oil that's being extracted from southern Saskatchewan and northern North Dakota at this point. And that oil has to get to market in a number of different ways. About half of it is headed south to the Gulf of Mexico. About a quarter of it is headed to northwestern states, and about a quarter of it comes through the Hudson River Valley in order to get to market. What's being proposed here is there's major refineries in Linden, New Jersey. They then kind of refine the oil and ship it out to various different locations. But the barges are not the only means by which oil is coming through. We've heard a lot about oil trains over the past couple years. There's also active proposals for oil pipelines, specifically the Pilgrim Pipelines proposal, which is 260-mile long parallel pipelines that are proposed to run down the New York State Thruway. So what we're seeing here with the situation with the barges is, again, kind of part of a broader global economic phenomenon. The impacts to this can really be broken down into a few major categories, and I'll be focusing mostly on the community impacts. The community impacts that Scenic Hudson is concerned about, that we are hearing from local constituents about, kind of come down to lighting, noise, and air pollution. When these barges drop their anchor, which may very well happen at night, they're going to be running lights on the decks. Those lights are very bright. They can be very extensive. You can imagine what it would be like if just off the northern Dutchess coast and Ulster County coast alone, there were 7 different barges and tugs kind of waiting to move up to Albany. That's a lot of lights that could be shining into our communities. Those of us involved in planning boards, waterfront revitalization plans, local government, can all appreciate the incredible amount of investment that has happened by New York State and our local communities and our waterfronts over the years. Here in Rhinebeck, you appreciate really great waterfront in Rhinecliff. The Kingston Rondout area is hopping on every kind of major holiday and on weekends. There's actively used waterfront in Port Ewan. I know Kathy Quick from the town of Esopus is here with us tonight. So all of this investment that we have been making in our waterfronts is suddenly going to kind of be at risk of this light pollution. In addition to that, the light requires generators to run, and these generators make noise. In many cases, they may be diesel generators. So associated with that, there are concerns about air pollution and exhaust. Local communities do have a really important tool for steering the future of their waterfront. The local waterfront revitalization plan is very critical in terms of a local community's partnership with New York State. And this is an area where communities should be looking carefully at their plans to understand how they may or may not relate to these anchorage proposals. My guess is that most of us have been really caught off guard by this sudden increase in the proposals that we've seen. There's also another set of concerns that relate to natural resource impacts. John talked a lot about the concerns on fish populations and kind of the benthic underwater habitat if there was a spill from these barges in the Hudson River. But there's also another type of impact that could be experienced, and that's from the actual anchors themselves. There are maps that have been, and imagery that's been developed by the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, that can show where anchors are dropped in the Hudson River. And they can see those areas as being significantly disturbed, not just from the location where the anchor hits the ground and drags, but also from the chain on the anchor. And literally, on these underwater images, you can see large circles on the river's bottom, which are disrupting habitat that are important for many threatened and endangered species. Specifically in New York State, two that are very important are the Atlantic sturgeon and the short-nosed sturgeon. One of the most popular winter grounds for these fish is right off the coast of Hyde Park, Rhinebeck, and Esopus. So this area is very important because they serve as spawning grounds for the sturgeon. They come up, they lay their eggs, the juvenile move into shallower waters, the fish grow to adulthood, and then they disperse. What is very disturbing about this Coast Guard proposal is that there's been very little, if any, coordination to date with the State Department of Environmental Conservation or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's especially more troubling because NOAA has actually put out their own proposed rule for how to manage this sturgeon habitat and other habitat for endangered and threatened species. So one very important point that we are asking people to weigh in their comments to the Coast Guard is to, again, call for public hearings to look at the community concerns, but also make sure that they are coordinating with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who has a kind of parallel rulemaking in terms of determining this habitat. The other major concern that we see that I know has been expressed by many community leaders further to the south who have already been out there in the press on this issue is safety and security concerns. Bakken crude oil is highly flammable. You may have attended some of the pipeline public forums or some of the oil train public forums that Scenic Hudson and Riverkeeper have organized in collaboration with each other. This is highly explosive, highly volatile material. This material could be sitting in these barges, in some cases, just a few hundred feet from our waterfronts. It has been brought to many people's attention that this does represent kind of a security risk and a potential risk of terrorism if someone was to meddle with the shipment. So security is certainly a very important concern. There's a lot to be worried about with this, but there's a lot to be hopeful about as well. One incredibly significant thing is the Coast Guard has given us an advanced rulemaking. That means we all have the maximum amount of time possible to respond and participate in the management of the anchorage sightings into the future. It's probably going to be about a 2-year process, is the best that we can determine at this point in time. But let's face it, federal agencies are big, they're bureaucratic, and once they get moving and develop momentum, they're like a juggernaut. They kind of don't stop. So it's critical that the Coast Guard hears from our communities early and often so that they kind of get on the right track from the start and are kind of fully considering the extent of the types of concerns we have. The other reason we have to be hopeful is that we are seeing an incredible response from our elected leadership here. I know there's multiple local elected officials here with us this evening. I just got back from Washington, D.C. in a late night train into Rhinecliff last night, where I met with the region's congressional delegation. And I can tell you, even though it's the August recess, and no one wants to be in Washington in the middle of August, it's like 90 degrees and humid. But the congressional staff are all over this, and they're paying very close attention. Scenic Hudson conveyed a request to the region's delegation that they should be weighing in with the Coast Guard now, asking for public hearings on this issue and bringing all of the community concerns to light. The word is not back. The final response from the offices yet. Obviously, they need to check with their principals. However, the initial response, I think, was very positive. And we're also seeing an incredible response from local leaders on this. So I want to just close on kind of sharing one story. The very first barge that was carrying Bicking crude oil story came down the Hudson River, what was it, in 2012? December 2012. What was the name of that barge? The Stena Primorsk. That barge ran aground just south of Albany. And we came so close to having a ruptured hull and thousands of gallons of oil spilling into the Hudson River. Fortunately, that barge was a newer model. It had double hulls. The outer hull was breached, but the inner hull stayed intact. That was a disaster averted. We didn't have to go there, but I think it really shows the gravity of this situation. We can all appreciate that congestion and increased traffic will also bring with it an increased risk, not just from the incidence of barges, but the more moving barges and boats in the river makes a much more difficult situation for the pilots to manage. So we need to be paying close attention to that. And finally, just to remind everyone, the deadline for public comment to the Coast Guard is September 7th. So please get your comments in soon. You can send them through a number of mechanisms. I believe there's material available on the town's website that was put up in conjunction with tonight's meeting. You can contact the Coast Guard. You can get their email address. My conversations with the agency is they want to hear from the public on this. So really, it's an opportunity that we should all seize. And just to reiterate another point that John made, the more substantive you can make your comments, the better. If you're just kind of coming at it from a not in my backyard perspective, that's not going to get their attention as much as it is if you raise real substantive questions that relate to the goals of your community and the health of the river.